Arkady Gips. He's originally a Ukrainian native, but is now an American, and we welcome him to this country. He's worked very hard this year to help his people in his native country of Ukraine. Maybe some of you have been to some of the benefits we've done. He performs all over the planet, including recently, he's done 2 world tours with Madonna, which he described as being in a luxury army. And he'll be back with us at the end of the show. I'm Eric Nesbitt. I'm very happy to be your host tonight. Before we go any further, I want to thank some people, beginning with Sunbury Press, also our sponsors, the McConnell Arts Center, Songs at the Center, Ohio Humanities, and Prologue Bookshop, who will be, after the talk, will be selling books and the authors will be signing them. And I want to let you know that our authors tonight are donating all of the pre-sales from tonight's sales to the Kentucky flood victims. Now we're here tonight to celebrate a book, the release of a book, which has truly changed our understanding of the Civil War and of civil rights. W.G., the opium-addicted, pistol-toting preacher who raised the first federal African-American troops. It's written by a dynamic brother and sister team. First of all, Donna Burtch is a writer and poet. She's a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan University and the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. After a career in marketing and fundraising for firms, not-for-profits, and universities, she is now a full-time poet and writer. She has completed a biography of her late father's life, In the Key of C, The Life and Times of William A. Burtch. She is currently working on a novella, and she and her family live here in Columbus. William Burtch was a finalist for the American Fiction Short Story Award, appearing in American Fiction Volume 17. William's work creatively spans magazine, journal, and anthology publications, from River Feet Press to Ruminate Magazine. William worked for many years in the investment business before he began writing. His work often expresses the themes of survival in a culture of addiction, and William cites the influence of his late wife, Carrie, who he describes as selfless and inspirational, and she has gifted him with perspective. William lives in Columbus, too. Let's welcome our sibling authors, Donna Burtch and William Burtch. Well, welcome, guys.
Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone.
Doing fine. You know, I think it's representative of our culture that you're here in Worthington, because our founder, James Kilbourne, was an abolitionist, and Worthington was founded with that tradition. And so to release this book, which I can't wait for those of you who've not read it to hear the story, because it truly does change our opinion of the Civil War and civil rights. But I want to go to the title first. W.G., the opium-addicted, pistol-toting preacher who raised the first federal African-American troops. Now, in this book, it's a divided nation. There's an opiate addiction going on. There's guns and racial tensions. So, and smack in the middle of that is religion. Are you sure this is a Civil War story? Because that's kind of the time we're living in now.
history is so important because it does give you a sense of perspective in terms of, this was 160 years ago we're talking about in this book. W.G. Raymond was a remarkable character that we'll get into here as we go along. But the times he lived in, you're right. I mean, a lot of those themes you just mentioned could have come from today's headlines. And I think, the lesson is, in my view, is that, it doesn't mean that things can't change. But what it means is it's how difficult it is and how much we have to work together to change things. And that's why the study of this kind of thing, this kind of a history, I think, is so important.
Yeah, can I ask you if your mic's on?
I don't know.
No, it's not. Oh. Here, just use this one.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have it wired.
Well, you don't.
Is that any better?
That's great. We can hear you now. Great. Did you all get the answer to that question, though? Because it was good.
Very patient.
It was brilliant.
Thank you.
So,
I don't
Oh.
think it's plugged in.
okay. Well, you just plug that one in there.
No, thank you.
Well, my question when I read this book was, I think, wait a second. I saw a movie called Glory, and I thought that was the first African American troop, and that was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment.
Right.
How does what WG put together differ from that?
And that's a great question, and there are some very distinct differences. The 54th of Massachusetts was, as you probably are familiar through, I think it was a 1989 movie, Glory, which was a remarkable movie that told an incredible tale of the regiment from Massachusetts. In January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, or signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And at that time, in the state level, states' rights, states were really, in the driver's seat in many ways. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, many of the states took it upon themselves to begin recruiting African Americans to fight. They wanted to fight. Many regiments were eager to get formed. And Massachusetts, Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts authorized the 54th of Massachusetts and appointed Robert Gould Shaw to be its commander-in-chief. And it was remarkable. At the time, even after Lincoln signed that in January of 1863, he still struggled on the policy with respect to African Americans fighting and joining the Union effort for a variety of reasons, human and political. But his primary concern that we can determine is that he was very concerned about African Americans being captured as prisoners of war and their treatment. And he was concerned about that. And in fact, he was kind of on the fence. But once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the momentum made the decision for him. There was a lot of interest. Many African Americans wanted to fight, to join the effort. And so the distinctions, Eric, the Massachusetts, of course, approved by the governor. Lincoln did not authorize the 54th of Massachusetts. He didn't dissuade the states from doing that. But he hadn't officially authorized that yet. And Frederick Douglass, a former slave and a remarkable orator at the time, had Lincoln's ear, and he kept, saying we need a federal regiment out of the District of Columbia to send the message and to change the tide. And so he was working on Lincoln with that, and our W.G. Raymond, who, by the way, was our three-time great-grandfather on our mother's side.
But let me pause there for a second. First of all, W.G. formed the first federal troop, and we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But he was a great-great-great-grandfather.
That's correct.
But tell us about how that led you to writing the book, because when I read the book, that's really beside the point. You know, it is.
Yeah, I think Donna can, speak to this as well. It was.
Yes. We had a family, you know how families have histories, and someone will start talking at a gathering and say, well, we're related to so-and-so, or your great-great-grandfather did this, or your great-grandmother did that. And we had those conversations with my mother's side of the family. And my relatives in Pennsylvania, our relatives said, he wrote an autobiography. And there was talk about, well, where is it? And eventually we got a hold of this pile of papers that had rubber bands around it. And it was, in fact, W.G.'s autobiography. He had written it, published it in 1892. And so this would be going back to when I was in my probably late 20s or early 30s. And we read it, and it was interesting, even at that time it was kind of interesting, but then life gets hold of you. A lot of stuff ensued, our careers, families, children, a lot of things. And so it was always in the back burner, and then a couple of years, maybe 10 years ago, I started to do some ancestry work, and I fleshed out the family line a little more, and there he was again. And so that's really how it started. We had his notes, and that became the start of what we did to create this book.
And it also gave you access, or not, that didn't give you access, but it gave you a start on the research to find letters from Lincoln
Yes.
and other people that backed up your work. And that to me is what's most impressive about this book, is the amount of research that went into
do
this.
a lot.
Yeah.
The pandemic kind of afforded us the time to do that.
You got to do something.
Yeah, you do, and that's what we talked about. But that's true. And as we looked at it, as Donna said, we looked at his memoirs, and honestly, we had not heard much beyond the fact that we had this great-great-grandfather that was involved in this effort, but we didn't have any of the details. And as we read through his memoir, a remarkable story started coming out. And at times we thought, well, is this too remarkable? We really hadn't corroborated it, or we hadn't seen it written about in too many places. And that intrigued us.
Well, tell us about how he got this invitation from Lincoln and what happened after that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, first to kind of step back for a moment, he was always an abolitionist, a staunch abolitionist, and he was a preacher in New York State, a small-town preacher. He was 43 years old, had a family, but he was always preaching about the importance of winning the war and essentially abolishing slavery. He was really staunch. And after a sermon one day, one of his parishioners came up to him and said, it's easy for you to stand there and say that, but what about you? Why aren't you signing up? And he had always thought of himself as a preacher and a family man, and he thought about it though. And the next day, he told his wife, "I'm going to enlist." And he
was about 40 at the time.
He was 43.
43, yeah.
A little overweight, he said, by his own admission. And so he enlisted, and he joined the 86th of New York, also known as the Steuben Rangers. And he didn't join as a chaplain, he joined as an infantryman. And 3 days later, he was promoted to first lieutenant. Well, they eventually made their way through their service down to Maryland and into Washington, D.C. And this is where Lincoln first took notice of him, is that this preacher who found himself, when he wound up in Washington, he was assigned duty with the Provost Guard. And his job was to go around breaking up, gambling and liquor and prostitution and so forth. And he packed a pistol, and he really went at it. And it was interesting. Margaret Leach wrote a Pulitzer awarded book on Civil War Washington, D.C. And in that, she mentioned W.G. Raymond for his zealousness. And she said that people would hear his boots and his men's boots coming, and they'd be heading for the door. He was pretty tough on But Lincoln took note of that, and then at the same time, the injuries, of course, were horrible in the Civil War, and the hospitals that were, literally tents and other makeshift structures were all about Washington, D.C. And Lincoln and other leaders at that time felt that there needed to be a spiritual component to the healing process. So he appointed W.G. Raymond as chaplain of the Washington, D.C. hospitals. And that's really when they first got to know each other, or they were made aware of each other, or he was of W.G. And he served out his time, and Donna can speak to some of the remarkable things he did as a chaplain as well.
Yeah. Well, we're basically looking at 3 weeks where he put this troop together.
That's correct.
And on May 22nd, 1863,
Yeah.
something happened, and
It did. He lobbied Lincoln to, he was first, he served his term as a chaplain of the Washington, D.C. hospitals, and he was honorably discharged in April of 1863. And right at that time, as we mentioned at the top, that, Lincoln was struggling with the notion of African Americans in joining the Union Army. And at that point, he was all in. He made up his mind that, this had to be. And he later famously was quoted as saying that, without the effort of the black Union soldiers, there would be no Union. They would not have won the war. So he was, he became all in. And W.G. Raymond, having just been honorably discharged and being just a staunch abolitionist, wanted to get involved in this new federal effort that Frederick Douglass had, persuaded Lincoln to do. And that's how he wrote letters to Lincoln, and Lincoln authorized it. And they went at it. And, in a few short weeks, as you mentioned, they raised hundreds on the streets of Washington, D.C.
yeah, at some risk.
At a lot of risk.
Yeah, and he also put his own money, W.G. put his own money into funding these troops, $843.
That's
He
exactly
did,
right.
as
It
would-
was,
Well, that was
Yeah.
real money then.
that was real money.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he was the kind of person who went the distance. Whatever was required, he was going to do. And I have to back up 1 second and just say, back in the kitchen when he told his wife that he was going to enlist, you have to understand his wife laughed. I don't think she believed him. And she was pregnant with their second child when he made that decision to go. So she deserves a lot of credit too.
Yeah.
But his time as a chaplain really brought him in close contact with a lot of people, and he worked in really hard. One of his great strengths, I think, was that he could always see what needed to be done. And I was just going to read a really short little piece here about his work as a chaplain, because he could notice things and then he fixed them. He was a fixer. W.G. applied the same enthusiasm in this new capacity, meaning in his role as chaplain, as he had during his provost guard days. The first abuse that I sought to correct, he recalled, was the manner in which they buried the soldiers, the imperfect coffins full of cracks, the number they would dump into one wagon, putting them into graves half filled with water and leaving them uncovered until the next day or so. And another example of his strength is there was an order that was written by a General Hammond to move people. Again, these were some makeshift hospitals. They were going to move 30 men to other places. And GJ, that's my fiance.
Busy guy.
You were busy, GJ, back then. WG, he said, this can't be because these men will die. And he knew it. He'd been spending all this time with them. So he orchestrated this move that involved senators. It involved letter writing on a Sunday night. It involved taking people off the path to their church services. And he got that order countermanded that night. And so that's just an example of what he could do when he saw an opportunity that he felt he needed to step up to.
Right.
But there was some tension
Yes.
between Stanton and Lincoln, and that manifested itself in the record of WG.
It did. And this is kind of a good point to go back to sort of the beginning question around the distinction between the 54th and the federal troops. So when W.G. Raymond and one of his associates, J.D. Turner, he had been another infantryman as well as a chaplain, received authorization from Abraham Lincoln to raise a federal regiment of African-American troops. And this would be the first federal or the first District of Columbia troops. It was, again, Lincoln had just really made up his mind, and Edwin Stanton ran the War Department, and he was known to be pretty iron-fisted, and he liked to run a tight ship under his control. And when Lincoln sent W.G. Raymond and J.D. Turner to meet with Edwin Stanton to begin the recruiting of the troops, Lincoln crafted a letter that said to do all you can to help these two guys do this. And Lincoln appointed J.D. Turner colonel and W.G. Raymond lieutenant colonel of the new regiment. Well, Stanton, is documented, threw the order down on the table and said this is highly irregular. He was very, he felt an affront to his operation and to his autonomy and control over the troops. And at the same time, again, we've got Massachusetts, we've got Louisiana, we've got several state regiments building, and they're fighting. They're out in the battlefield. And things are happening fast. And now the federal regiment is getting involved, and Stan, frankly, was getting a little panicked that things were just kind of spiraling out from under him. And so he was offended that, and what he required, that was not required of any other troops, Edwin Stanton required that W.G. Raymond first raise 640 men and have all 640 pass inspection before he would muster them in, and that was not required of anyone before. And beyond that, he withheld appropriations for those troops during those weeks until they got together 640 men and then, were passed. But so W.G. Raymond, he was so committed to this cause that he foot the bill for tents and food and training and uniforms and so forth. And then Stanton, again, feeling that this was just getting a life of its own, felt he had to do something quickly, and he established the Bureau of Colored Troops, it was called at the time. And his vision was that this would rein in all activities, soldiering activities of African Americans into one sort of bureaucracy, if you will. And he put this new bureaucracy in the basement of the War Department. And this is, to us, just was such a fascinating fact. In the middle of the night, he snuck the troops, Stanton did, to an island in the Potomac, Anastolan Island, and it's now a national park. And once he did that, Lincoln set out like the next day or two to inspect the troops. He was very keenly interested in how they were doing. And he set out to see them, and they were gone. And so Stanton moved them, unbeknownst to the commander-in-chief himself. And it was indicative of how offended he was that this was put upon him, so to speak. And at the same time, he quickly shifted command of the troops to someone of his own choosing, very, abruptly. And officially, May 22nd of 1863, the Bureau of Colored Troops was established, and then from there on out is where really the history started with respect to federal troops. And the 3 or 4 weeks and the hundreds of men that were trained and raised and paid for by W.G. Raymond, there's no pension records, there's no there's no War Department, records of their activities for those few weeks. He started everything May 22nd and forward.
But all that's documented in this book.
It is.
And that's why it's really fresh news in the Civil War and in civil rights. And tell us about some of the historians you've contacted who were shocked at this and very grateful for it.
It was. As we were doing our research, we met some folks that were really scholars in the field of the Civil War, particularly with respect to African Americans. And some of them were quite well published, and we reached out to consult with them and even request blurbs for their book or for our book, and one of them did. And they were surprised. This had fallen through the cracks. This whole episode, and one of them, who's really a national expert on this, had never heard of W.G. Raymond, and she read the book and was just blown away by the research that went behind it. And she said, "This is truly, after 160 years, in her mind, this is new information," which seems ridiculous after 160 years, but but it was. And most historians rely on pension records, and they rely on War Department records as they research that era. And of course, neither of those carried any record of this. But it's so well documented in Lincoln's library, newspaper accounts, other history books. There are a few history books.
And W.G. was given a Bible during this period.
Oh,
and
yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes. When he prepared to leave as chaplain, because he had done so much to help the people who had been injured, they presented him with a Bible, and we've told Eric the Bible weighed 30 pounds, and it was inscribed to W.G., and thanked him for the kind of service, the kind of man he was, and what he put forth. And we haven't formally organized our thoughts around this, but one of the things that Bill and I want to do is put the word out so that we can try and find that Bible. We know it exists somewhere. It'd be hard to throw away a 30-pound Bible from the Civil War times.
Yeah. Well, I want to move on a little bit because the title of the book is The Opium Addict.
Oh, yeah.
Pistol-toting preacher.
Oh, yeah.
That's in there too. And for those of you who think that this is a book fawning over their great-great-great-grandfather, I can assure you that his weaknesses are shown. So where did the opium addiction come from?
Yeah.
And what's this about pistol-toting and
Well,
faith healing and all this stuff?
Right.
There's more to W.G. because he was 43 at
Right.
this point.
He was a complicated guy.
He was a
Yeah.
complicated guy, and the opium part of it, I feel very comfortable addressing because he, at the time, during the Civil War, and again, the wounds that people were experiencing in the kind of face-to-face, up-close combat and the weaponry that was used inflicted terrible, terrible wounds. And we've probably all seen pictures. I mean, people lost limbs. It was horrible. And at the time, opium, of course, opium's been around for a long, long time, long ago. But during this time, there was a doctor, a Scottish doctor named Wood. His last name was Wood, and he invented the hypodermic needle. And so for the first time, instead of diluting opium with alcohol in order to get people to kind of take morphia for the pain they were experiencing, they were able to deliver it with hypodermic needles for the first time. And it was very important as a painkiller for the wounds and everything. But what people didn't understand, and there was no regulation at all until 1914 when a Narcotic Act was first put into place, doctors prescribed it pretty freely. And so W.G. had always had a lot of issues in his stomach, bladder, liver, and he just tried to forge on. But his doctor, Dr. Kent, who was a homeopath of some reputation, prescribed opium for him. And for 10 years, W.G. was addicted. It happened so quickly, and he writes of his experience. And I do have one quick explanation of what it had to have felt like to him. This was about another Civil War figure who had represented the Union, and he was held captive by the Confederates, and they didn't feed him. They put him in sun, they put him in cold. His whole body tightened up. When he was finally released, he was a fragment of his former self. He had been deprived of food and left to rot in the heat. His stomach had hardened, and he was in constant pain. And here's how he described what the relief was, which was the opium. I found myself in the fangs of a monster more terrible than the Hydra of Lerna, and whose protean powers it is not man's to know till it is too late to escape. He said he felt hopeless upon a dark and boundless sea, drifting further from the land. And that's what W.G. experienced until very close, to, probably the last 15, maybe 12 years of his life.
Yeah, and in that period, I mean, he started his career as a preacher. From the time he was a child, he was told that he had a gift for that.
Yes.
But there was a real crisis of faith with him where he completely didn't believe, but he was brought back to faith. And how did that happen?
Well, he honestly took a revolver and went out into the woods when he was in the throes of this addiction.
Yeah.
And he was either going to find some way to absolve himself of this issue, or he was going to end it, basically.
He spent 6 months. He returned to Washington, D.C. after he had lived in various places throughout the country. And he returned to Washington, D.C., where, if you think about it, he had been all that. And he was all not that, because he was addicted to opium. He lived in a little room. He had nothing.
Away from his family. We
Away
might say
from
that
everyone, yeah.
He lost 2 of his
Yeah,
wives.
Yes, he
Yes,
lost 2 of his
that's right.
wives. A couple of his sons had passed away, and he lived on milk and bread. And all he had to do was read the Bible, and he had a hymnal. And so at the end of that period where he was basically a recluse is when he went to potentially take his own life. And he left the key in his door because he wanted people to be able to go back to his room should he not return. I mean, he was at the end of his rope.
And he was literally at a rock.
Yes.
Yes, he
And-
was between a rock and a really hard place.
Yeah. And what happened at that rock?
Well, that's where he
He had what can only be described really as a conversion experience,
Yeah.
not unlike Saul on the road to Damascus, or Paul on the road to Damascus, became Paul. It was hours. He was in this particular favorite spot that Bill and I want to go to. It's in Rock Creek Park near Washington, D.C., and he tried to find the right place to be in the park, and he kept moving around. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he found a spot, and he was praying. He was praying in a desperate way, and he finally felt a presence, and it literally washed over him. He felt the pain leave his body. He felt his the claws of opium leave. It all left him. And he was a new man. He really had that kind of experience. He got up and went back to his life, never took opium again, and lived out the rest of his days in a very fruitful way.
right.
But he was faith healing then, too.
Yes, he
Yeah,
was.
He did that as well. But an interesting point about this, this whole episode of the opium addiction really, it was a low point of his life, and he was ashamed
Yeah.
of it. And to give you a sense of his character, when he went out to Kansas, he did some work out in Kansas after the grasshopper plague of the late 1800s, and helping them come out of that. In talking about that period of his life, he said that he was ashamed because he found himself doing what he called worldly pursuits. Worldly pursuits. And what he listed was croquet,
Checkers.
checkers,
Yeah.
yes, a
Going to
fishing
fairs.
trip with his buddies. So he'd be very disappointed in me. But that gives you an idea of his character, and so he was such a conflict. We've talked about him being an amalgamation of so many sort of conflicting traits, all wrapped up into one person.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of writing this book.
Yeah.
Because when you started it, it wasn't a book.
Oh, no.
What was your initial concept for this?
Well, again, we was like, well, let's finally figure out this story. So our first path, which neither of us knew anything about, was we thought, well, this might make an interesting documentary. Let's look at that. And we've known Eric a long time, and we thought, well, hey, he'd be great to narrate it. And so we started down that road, and then we thought, in doing so, we'll come up with something for the extended family, a book that sort of tells them the story. And as we started doing that, though, we started reading what we wrote, and it was like, this is really a book. And not only that, but the story kind of, goes beyond our immediate family or extended family. This has implications that go beyond that. And that's when we made the commitment to try to make it a book. We're both writers. This is the first time we've collaborated, but it was like, let's do this. And the pandemic gives us the time to do it. So that's kind of the story. It started out as being, let's learn how to make a documentary. Let's, try to write something for the family. And next thing you know, we're writing a book. And lo and behold, there was interest in it in the publishing.
Well, one of the funny things is when you told me that you decided to make a book out of it, it's like, oh no, now we're going to have to do footnotes and all that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And we did.
And
it was
do an
back to
index.
school. Yeah, it was kind of a flashback.
But I mean, I think that this is, now that it's in book form, this would make a tremendous documentary and movie because WG is such a wild character.
He is,
Yeah.
and and it's unfortunate that he fell through the cracks because of this sort of tiff. But even more importantly, that there were hundreds of African Americans that enlisted on the streets of D.C. And to get back to the 54th, that was in Massachusetts, which was a little more open to the abolition. They were more supportive of that. The streets of D.C. at that time were a real mess. I mean, there was a heavy Confederate influence, there was a heavy Northern influence, it was a lot of outlaw activity going on. It was a wild place. And these are the streets where they signed up without the support of the War Department at that time. To me, that's just remarkable. And you can ask, does it matter, that those few weeks, does it matter if we started May 22nd and go on, and we just came down hardly on, this really matters. Lincoln appointed them. These men signed up on those streets, and WG almost took a bullet in the head in a recruiting meeting. Someone shot through a window. There was a lot of resistance. The troops, as they marched on the streets of D.C., took horrible taunts, and they persisted. And so yes, it matters, and it's important. And our whole purpose with this is to make sure this story gets told, because it is an important part of history.
Well, in a lot of your work, though, you seem to focus, one of the themes is giving credit to people who have not received credit.
Right.
That's very important to both
Right.
of you.
Right. We definitely wanted to do this. We wanted to get the story out there. It just felt too important to just let it arbitrarily fall through the cracks because they want to start records on the May 22nd.
Yeah.
So that's what this is all about, really. And
Now, I want to ask you a question about being sibling authors.
right.
Anyway, first of all, I want to say, make a good example for those of us with siblings, that you can work together. But, in the music business, we talk about sibling harmony. And you get, a singing group together of people that are related, and the voices match perfectly, and it's just gorgeous stuff. Same kind of thing has happened with you in literature, where your voices work together. You research, you're both writers, and
Right.
how did this work for you? Did you get along? Were there moments of, disagreement or what? Tell us about this, because it's really it is a different approach,
I'll go
but it
first.
works.
It did. It was remarkable. Technology, of course, helped.
A lot.
I was holed up in my place, and she was in her place, and it was, what we would do is we literally sat down one day and said, hey, how are we going to do this? And we took major sort of areas of his life and divided them up. He was a preacher, he was a infantryman, he was a chaplain, he was all these things. Father, husband. We split all those up very arbitrarily, and went at it. And then we said, when you have something, send it to me. When I have something, I'll send it to you. And our voices just merged. And the real risk, obviously, in a co-author situation is the voices don't mesh, and you can tell that it was a mixture. But and it was interesting because I primarily have only ever written fiction, and she primarily had written nonfiction, you know, biographies and things. So we weren't sure how it was going to work, but we were pleasantly surprised. At least I think.
Oh yeah, no.
I'll let her speak for herself.
No, it was great. I mean, you know, and we didn't always get along as children. We had a pretty good childhood together, but I mean, he did hit me with an aluminum baseball bat over my head. I did ride a bike.
There's another book.
Yeah, yeah. So it wasn't all roses, but in this process, it's been strange. It's almost like it was meant to be because, you know, in terms of like even corroborating all the facts that were in the book, in his original notes and in what we discovered in other places, it all fit. So that was very relieving to us. But our instincts were pretty much the same. I mean, even when we started to reach out to publishers and agents, that's quite a process in itself. And we kind of had the same take. Like we'd research who we wanted to connect with, hope to connect with, and often the same names were on our two lists. It was just, it's been kind of uncanny, and we've had a lot of laughs over the time. We've had frustrations, but for the most part, it's been a very enjoyable, and I mean, the best thing you can do if you want to write something is have a great partner, because it makes it fun.
Yeah.
It was just a wonderful experience, yeah.
So
do it again.
So what's next for you guys? I know that you love research, and
I love to research.
And the publication has asked you to be a guest editor. So tell us what's going to be next.
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
I have a novella. I started writing in 2011, so I've made a couple revisions to it. I've sort of shopped it out a little bit. I haven't gotten any serious takers yet, so I want to work on that a little bit. And I'd also like to see what other life, this would be a collaborative work, what other life we can find for this story. You know, whether it is a documentary or whether it is a film. I'd like to see, I'm sorry, I've got to back up one sec. The other thing I want to do is go to the places that are in the book.
Yeah.
Now that we can kind of move with a little more freedom, it's so important, I think, especially that rock in Rock Creek Park. I want to find it. I know we can do it because I've isolated it. I know where it is in the big park, and I want to go there and spend a little time. So that's what I'm about.
Gosh, I've got a collection of short fiction that I'm getting ready to shop around. That's been in the works for a while. I've got a couple of anthology stories coming out, one in 2023, and then I had a wonderful experience recently as a guest editor for the summer edition of the Watershed Journal, which was a wonderful experience. They're a great little journal over in the Allegheny Mountains, and it's a favorite place of the country for me. So largely that. See what else comes out of this.
Well, I want to say you're very inspiring to all of us because I've known you've had a long career in investments, and you've had a long career in everything, and
Just long.
yeah, and you know, you just start writing and turning stuff out, and people are publishing it. I know it's been a very tough road, but you've made incredible progress.
Yeah, you have to get used to rejections quickly.
Yeah,
you sure
That's
do.
a big part of the game, but
Yeah.
but it's wonderful. It's been a great experience. Columbus is a wonderful literary
Yeah, it is.
community.
Yeah.
There's some tremendous journals here in town, and it's just a real literary
Yeah.
special
Well,
place.
I want to tell all of you to please buy the book because he's a very complicated person,
He is.
Yeah.
and you've really brought somebody very important to life. And if you want to know more about the Civil War and some stories that have never been told before, it's in here. You've done a great job of bringing it to life.
Well, thank you. And I want to say
Yeah.
one of the great joys for us has been the people we've met in this path, because we've met some amazing people. But we've worked side by side with Eric to plan for this evening and to make it hopefully flow a bit. And you have to understand, this is a guy who is amazingly talented and in so many arenas. He's a songwriter, he's a singer, he's an inspirational speaker. He's writing he's writing a book that we are very excited to see come to fruition. He's lived in Worthington his whole life, and Worthington's so lucky to have him, and this place is lucky. His songs at the center that he created with some help from good people is now in 400 and some stations that play the series. Yeah.
Yeah, I just reiterate that. It's been a real joy, and we appreciate Eric doing this. He's a busy guy, and we're just really honored that he would take the time to do this. And
Well, it's been my pleasure, but I got to tell you, I'm going to ruin everything you just said because I'm going to sing with Arcadi. This is
that would be, please do.
We're going to take some questions here in a moment, but I'm going to invite Arcadi back up, and it's a song that we basically put together tonight, and it's Abraham Lincoln's favorite song. It's called 20 Years Ago, and according to John Meacham, it was his favorite song. The original version of it was Abraham Lincoln loved slow ballads, and the original version of it was 7 verses with no choruses. So it lasted approximately as long as the Civil War. But Arcadi and I have sped it up a little bit, and we've cut out 4 verses, and we'll see what happens.
Okay.
And then we're going to take your questions.
Sure, it's a quarter, right? Let's
I've wandered through the village, Tom. I've sat beneath the tree, down upon the schoolhouse playing sheltered you and me. But none were there to greet me, Tom, and few were left to know that played with us upon the grass some 20 years ago. The river's running just as still, the willows on its side are larger than they were, dear Tom, the stream appears less wide. The grapevine swing is ruined now, where once we played the bow and swung our sweethearts, pretty girls, just 20 years ago. Some are in the church house laid, some sleep beneath the sea, but few are left of our old class excepting you and me. And when the time shall come, dear Tom, and we are called to go, I hope that they'll ask where we played just 20 years ago. I think that might have raised Lincoln from his grave. But anyway.
It was beautiful.
All right. Well, we're going to take some questions now. We can bring the house lights up so we can see the faces. And who's got a question?
Here's that awkward moment.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a very good question. The original, his original memoirs that sort of started this whole process. The condition that they were in when we first got them was not very good. They were held together by rubber bands. They had been photocopied. They were not in really good shape.
A little
now,
jumbled
together. And I think that's what discouraged for quite a while, someone in the family really diving into this story. It wasn't very inviting. And fortunately, Donna looked, and it is in the Library of Congress, his memoirs. They were published in 1892. And they're now in the public domain, his memoir. Donna found, believe it or not, an actual first edition of the book that came out in 1892. It was in a rare bookshop somewhere, yeah.
It was at 3 in the morning one night when I couldn't sleep, and I just thought, this has to be somewhere. And so I found it at this place called Abe's Bookstore in, I think it was in Maryland.
Yeah, and as being in the public domain, there are also some companies out there that do reprints, and we found a few of those. So as we worked on the book together, we had paperback copies, so it became much easier and much more coherent. It was much easier to read. But one of the things I do want to just say is one of the real joys of this process has been corroborating what he said in his memoir, because some of them, frankly, when we first read them, seemed pretty far-fetched. And we went through every major representation that he made, and we were able to piece it together, and it held together. And that was probably one of the greatest feelings that we got out of this.
I'll also add that a lot of the publications are actually in the book. There's plenty of pictures and a lot of the...
We try to illustrate or add exhibits, actual photocopies from Lincoln's library and from the Library of Congress and so forth, and try to build the whole story that way.
Okay, next question, yes.
Could you give an example or two of some of the kinds of things that happened that you were then able to corroborate, and kind of out of what source
Sure.
did you find the corroboration?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important ones was, did they have authorization to raise a regiment for the District of Columbia? And we located Lincoln's, now he mentioned in his memoir what Lincoln had said, that they met with him and Lincoln said, I'm going to send you to Edwin Stanton, and here's a letter that you take with you. Well, we found a copy of that letter, and that letter is actually in Lincoln's
Presidential library.
and it's in the book. We included it, as a reference in the book as well. That was one example. And it was interesting that the local press, was very supportive in Washington. Now, the New York Times, interestingly, cautioned at the time against going too quickly into African American troops fighting. They were concerned it was going to cause a greater divide in the country. But the Washington press corps seemed to be enthusiastic about it, and maybe it was just because of the news story happening right in front of them, and that made their life easier. But they reported on this very diligently, and with research the way it is now, you can go back and we found, newspaper clippings that corroborated his remarkable story, and it's
Even the excuse me, he had listed the amount that he had gone into to supply funds for the troops that they raised in those 3 weeks.
right.
He said it was $843. And sure enough, we found the records in the House of Representatives.
War Claims Committee,
So they had been lifted up.
and it was $843.
So those were great moments, because you just think, my gosh.
Yeah, it was interesting. But that's a good question. And there were several of those. It was just, we were so excited, we'd call each other at any time of the day and just say, oh my God, I just found this. And the internet, of course, makes that kind of thing possible. That would have been very difficult to uncover a lot of these physically before. And so that helped a lot. Very good question. I think I saw one over here as well.
Yes.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask
Hi, Amy.
about your
Yeah.
Has it put you in contact with any of his more direct?
That's a
Yeah.
great question, because the first thing that happened, we got to a certain point in our project and we thought, you know what, we better share this with our first cousins because, you know, they were familiar with the story too. So we arranged this Zoom call, funny thing, we get right to the point where we're gonna say, and here's what we found. And the call ended.
Yeah.
But we eventually, you know, got that straight. But we did find a woman, yeah, we did find a woman named Brenda Hartnett out in, and she lived in California when we lived out there, which is really interesting to me. But she is our fourth cousin. She was a descendant of his as well, and she's been very, very supportive. We've stayed in touch. I hope someday to meet her. She has one of his first editions. She has one of his original books. So that's a great question.
Yes.
Hey, Chuck. Oh, my goodness. How you doing, Chuck? Thanks for coming.
Yes, I found the story about the opium interesting. It makes a lot of sense during the war. It had been a useful painkiller, but this is the first I've ever heard of anything. Was this widespread?
Yeah.
Was it, and when did W.G. Rankin, did he start using it after the war or during the war?
It was after the war when he started using it. And we found a lot of accounts of soldiers who became addicted to it, not knowing they were going to become addicted to it. And no one fully realized how.
Did it have a stigma attached to it?
Yes, it did, because people felt it was a moral failing. You know, those myths
I
are
think
hard to fight.
Yeah, the addiction aspect of it did have, stigma to it. But it was distributed like Tylenol, basically, at that time. There were no restrictions. But when it became clear that it had such an addictive property to it, and certainly W.G., as I mentioned earlier, he was very ashamed of it. He felt, dependent on it. He didn't like that. But yeah, the injuries were so severe they didn't know what to do, and it was, that's how it sort of took hold. But again, it kind of goes to the very top what Eric said, that it's just remarkable to us when you talk about, here we are talking about an opium pandemic or epidemic, and it, there it was 160 years ago, and so many of the same issues. But yeah, it was quite a period of time. It really was.
Yes.
Hi.
Oh my goodness, Kathy, hi.
I'm curious about his background as a pastor and preacher. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I didn't hear the first part.
Yeah, the question was his background as a pastor and a preacher, and
Oh, yeah.
he started out quite rebellious. His parents were quite devout. He was quite rebellious as a teen, and
Yeah,
know,
his family, they were Baptists, and his whole family was I would call them devout. They lived their faith, and he and his friend were having a wild time. He was in his late teens, and I don't know what. He didn't unpack it. It might have been checkers. I don't know. But yeah, he said he enjoyed pursuing worldly pleasures, as how he phrased it. And his mother and father, they were praying for him. His mother cried. He could hear her cries. It weighed on him, but he didn't change his ways. And then at the time, there were these revivals that occurred, and there was a fellow who was traveling all over with these revivals, and they begged W.G. to go to it, and finally he agreed to go with his friend, his partner in crime, but really to go, and they could take the information they got during the revival and make fun of it, was their intent. But when he got in there, something happened to him, and he looked at his father's face, he looked at his mother, all the people started praying around him, and he felt ashamed. I mean, it was powerful for him. And after that, they baptized. At that time, they believed in full immersion, so they took him right out to the Seneca Lake, and just, and that was it for him. He was all in, and he went to Hamilton Theological and Literary College, which now is Colgate University, and he studied to become a minister, and he was ordained in I think it was 43, and he retained his faith connection the rest of his life. In various ways, I will say.
Yes.
So I do have a question, actually, for each of you independently.
Okay.
As you read this history, you think about if you could go back and insert yourself somewhere in that book, in that life, where would it be? What one point for each of you individually?
Okay.
Wow, that's an interesting question. For me, I think all along I've been curious about his family. His family of origin, his first wife. He ended up having 10 children. He was married 3 times. His first 2 wives passed away. And he married a woman that he never talked about. So that's still a mystery we'd like to know more about. And he had 2 young children. He was almost 60 when he had those children. But what I'd like to know, I would like to have been in the kitchen when he announced to his wife, who was pregnant, as I said, hey, I think I'm gonna, head off and fight on the front lines. I would just like to have seen what was in her, I'd like to know what was in her heart and what that was like.
Yeah, wow. I think I'd travel down that same road, and I think I would really like to be part of the Steuben Rangers, which were the 86th of New York when he enlisted as an infantryman as opposed to a chaplain. They found themselves in many interesting situations. Of course, that's how they wound up in Washington. But one story that came to mind, as they were moving down through Maryland and close to D.C., and they were out hunting one day, a few of him and his regiment, and they came across the shack, and there was an very old, elderly African-American woman there, and she invited them in, and she had a little shack there, and they got to talking, and they were quite interested in her situation and her story, and she started telling them a story, and she had several children. She had been a slave, and she wound up bearing 3 sons that were actually from her master, as they called them back then. And then she went on to say that they had sold those 3 sons, and he was just appalled that he said, well, you mean to tell me he sold his own sons? And she said, oh yeah, that was, And well, they were just so taken by her story that they kept her in firewood and food. She was very much at the end of her life, but they kept her in food and firewood. And then when she passed, he contacted from where she had come and said, she's passed. Is there anything you would like to do? And they basically said, we don't want anything to do with it. And W.G. having that sort of moral fabric that we've talked about tonight, that bothered him. So they built her a casket, and they gave her a proper burial, and then from there he marched down, and his roles when he started the pistol toting, he was the provost guard, and I found that very interesting that he was shaking up a lot of stuff in Washington D.C. that were affecting a lot of people, and some of them in power, and they were quite taken back by that. But I would have loved to have ridden with the Steuben Rangers, and that probably would have been my answer for that question.
Yes.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, how are you? Bruce, I appreciate you coming.
Yeah, you bet. Just curious, how much information did your parents have about WG, or maybe your grandparents
Right.
have, prior to you doing all the research and writing this book?
Boy, I tell you, it was not much. The story, and I think this was pretty consistent throughout the family, was we had this 3-time great-grandfather, ours and our first cousins. And the basic knowledge ended with, he knew Lincoln. He got permission from Lincoln to raise a regiment of African Americans. He paid for them himself, and he never got repaid. That was basically, that was the story that was in our family for many years, and that's what we heard. And I think, going back to her question, the copies that we had were just pretty bad, and so that was all that anybody ever deciphered, and that was what we wanted to do, was to finally get some meat around that story. But it was very little, Bruce. It was not much to work with.
And part of it, real quickly, is our grandfather from that line passed away when he was 33, and our grandmother passed away pretty early as well.
Right.
So I think part of it was those who could have carried the story forward were gone. So
All right, they're going to be available to answer some more questions. So let's, afterwards at the signing, so let's take one more question. And yes,
hi, Lori. That'd be awesome.
That'd be great.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's a wonderful question.
What a great question.
If you could indulge me just one moment, I had meant to read these passages, but I think it's a great conclusion to the story, but also it kind of summarizes W.G., I think, as a person. And, you know, he, towards, you know, after the troops returned, and the first USCT, or the United States Colored Troops as it was called, had a victorious battle against Fitzhugh Lee, who was the nephew of Robert E. Lee. And it was probably the most significant victory for the USCT in the Civil War. And it was he literally, Fitzhugh Lee retreated to Richmond. And there were losses on both sides, but it was a victory.
Can I ask if you'd hold just one moment? Because I think that's the end note of all time. And I want to just answer Lori's question, because the one thing that opened my eyes, you would know the impact of the trustees at Ohio Wesleyan. And one of our trustees actually took us, several of us, to Gettysburg and hired guides who took us through the battles. And that really left an impact on an imprint in my mind. But really, it's the liberal arts. You know, I read a lot of wonderful books when I was a student at Ohio Wesleyan, and all of those experiences stayed with me. So, thank you. But this is an ending that is perfect.
They had what was called, you know, of course, after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, his vice president, became president. And they had what they called a grand review, which was the troops returning, from the battle. And it was a very regimented affair, a very formal affair, and the president would inspect the troops, and it was a pretty significant event. But W.G., I'll just read this. This is a quote from W.G. that we found in his memoir, and we cooperated this as well. "I was highly honored with a seat with the reviewers in front of the White House at the closing of the war, when the victorious Ulysses Grant and William T. Sherman were marching in their last grand review before the President of the United States, with worn and riddled flags. As I looked upon this scene that could but impress, those remaining boys in blue that had left home in manhood's strength and vigor, now returning after weary marches, perchance with sore and bare feet, while others had marched their last march. What a panorama presented itself to the mind's eye. What crushed longings and buried hopes. What homes that waited no coming greeting, but memories like sorrowing mourners were then vainly seeking the last resting places of those who had borne away with them so many of life's joys and dreams. Surely, what tongue can tell the miseries of war? None, none." And then, which we thought was pretty, profound. We wrote an introduction to the book, which I know a lot of people, I'm as guilty as anybody, don't read them, but I did want to read just the last couple of sentences of our introduction, because I think it's a conclusion that would be appropriate. But this is our introduction. "At times it seemed as though we were led by a force we did not understand to impossibly arcane sources that filled some critical piece of the story puzzle. To cover our bases, we send a nod and a thank you to WG. Your story is at last out there where it belongs. May you rest in peace. With that.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, once again, we want to thank all of you for coming, and we want to
Thank
thank
you.
Sunbury Press and the McConnell Arts Center, Songs at the Center, Prologue Bookshop, and Ohio Humanities. We will be out in the hallway to sign books and answer questions. And once again, let's have a big round of applause for Donna and Bill Burtch.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for coming. Eric, thank you.
Thank you so much.